I should have been dead that night. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, thought she had finally won when she pushed me toward the water, convinced a man like me would never crawl back out. After all, what's one neighbor compared to the $1.2 billion she stood to gain? To her, I was just an obstacle to a race. And for a while, I let her believe she succeeded. She strutted through the neighborhood like a victorious empress, throwing a celebration so extravagant it could have passed for a royal coronation. Champagne-poured music roared, and Karen smiled wider than ever, certain her little empire was secure. But here's the thing about people like Karen, they never see it coming when the dead return smiling. That night, as the lights glittered and laughter echoed, I walked back into her world, not as her victim, but as the surprise she'd never forget. Before we dive into the madness, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your location and the time in the comments below. I've lived in Oak Ridge Estates for nearly 15 years. It's one of those neighborhoods where everything looks like it belongs on the cover of a glossy real estate magazine. Perfect lawns, sparkling driveways, and homeowners who smile for show while secretly keeping score on whose roses bloom. First, I thought I had learned how to navigate the politics of this place, but I underestimated one person, Karen. Now every HOA has a Karen, but ours, she was the mother of all Karens. Blonde hair that had seen more bleach than sunlight, oversized sunglasses that made her look like an insect queen, and a voice sharp enough to peel paint off garage doors. She wasn't just a busybody, she was a schemer. And unfortunately for me, I became her latest target. It all started when she discovered I had inherited a piece of land undeveloped but valuable just outside the HOA's boundary. That little stretch of property was the key to a deal worth $1.2 billion with developers. Karen wanted it. No, she needed it. To her, it wasn't about money alone, it was about control. If she could secure the land and claim it as part of her empire, she would cement her status as the untouchable queen of Oak Ridge Estates. But there was one problem: me. I wasn't interested in her proposal to donate my land to the HOA. I wasn't interested in her veiled threats about community fines or her smug lectures about the greater good. That's when her smile hardened and I knew Karen had moved me from neighbor to enemy. She started slow planting rumors like weeds. "He's behind on his HOA dues," she whispered at the clubhouse. "He's hiding money," she told the board. "He's a risk to our community." The gossip spread faster than wildfire on dry brush, and soon even neighbors I'd known for years were giving me cautious looks. But Karen didn't stop there. She escalated. One morning I found a notice taped to my front door claiming I owed the HOA $1.2 billion in special assessments. Yes, you heard that right, $1 billion. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. But beneath the absurdity there was a sinister undercurrent. Karen wasn't joking. She was laying the groundwork to paint me as unstable bankrupt and ripe for removal. Then came the olive branch. "Why don't we talk this out by the lake?" she suggested one evening, her smile stretched so tight it looked painful. No lawyers, no board members, just neighbors. Now when Karen suddenly offers peace, you know there's poison in the wine. But curiosity and maybe arrogance got the better of me. I agreed. That Saturday the lake looked deceptively peaceful. The water shimmered under the sun, ducks glided lazily across the surface, and the air smelled of pine and barbecue smoke from nearby houses. Karen was already there, dressed in an immaculate white suit far too expensive for a lakeside stroll. She carried a leather folder tucked under her arm like a queen presenting a decree. "Glad you came," she said smoothly, motioning for me to sit on a bench near the dock. "This is just between us. No need to complicate things." I sat down, but my instincts screamed that something was off. Her two friends from the HOA board lingered in the background, pretending to admire the view, but watching me far too closely. Karen opened her folder with exaggerated grace, flipping through pages of forged documents that claimed I'd signed over my land. "This is your last chance to cooperate," she purred. "Sign this addendum and everything will be simple." Her tone was honey, but her eyes were venom. I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Karen, you can forge all the papers you want, but you can't fake my signature, and you sure as hell can't fake my consent." For a moment her mask cracked, her lips tightened, her jaw clenched. Then as quickly as it appeared, the facade returned. She snapped the folder shut and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Pity," she whispered. It was then that I noticed the dock beneath us wasn't as stable as it should have been. Loose boards. A rope coiled in the corner. The sudden awareness that her friends were now blocking the only exit. The air felt heavier, the sound of water lapping at the wood louder. Karen leaned closer, her perfume nauseatingly sweet. "You see, dear," she said softly, "sometimes people don't realize when they're already drowning. That's when I knew. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a trap. My heart pounded as I calculated my options. The lake stretched wide behind me, dark and cold. In front of me stood Karen, and her cronies' eyes gleaming with anticipation. It was as if they were savoring the moment before a lion devoured its prey. And yet in that twisted scene I found myself smiling. Because while Karen thought she held all the cards, she had no idea who she was dealing with or how far I was willing to go to turn her perfect trap against her. I stayed calm even as her plan closed around me like a net, because sometimes the best way to beat a predator is to let them believe they've already won. The moment Karen said those words, sometimes people don't realize when they're already drowning, I knew exactly what was about to happen. I'd seen that look before, the cruel satisfaction of someone who thought they had absolute power. Her cronies shifted closer, their shadows stretching across the dock. The water beneath us, once calm and glittering, suddenly felt like a grave waiting to be filled. She gave a nod so slight most people would have missed it. But I didn't. The two men stepped forward, their expensive loafers thudding on the wooden planks. And before I could even stand, a pair of hands shoved hard against my back. The world tilted. The dock disappeared. I plunged into the lake with a sickening splash. Cold water closed over my head, flooding my ears, burning my lungs. For a moment there was only darkness and silence, the kind that swallows you whole and whispers that this is where it ends. I kicked upward, desperate for air, but a weight pressed me down. Rope. The coil I'd seen earlier was now wrapped around my leg, yanked tight as if the lake itself wanted to keep me. Above the surface, muffled laughter cut through the water. I opened my eyes and saw distorted shapes. Karen's silhouette leaning over the dock, her white suit glowing like a phantom. Her voice echoed faintly through the water. "Goodbye, sweetheart." My chest burned. Every instinct screamed to inhale, but I knew that would mean death. My thoughts scrambled. Is this it? After everything, am I really going to let Karen, of all people, write my ending? Then an image flashed in my mind. My daughter's smile the morning she left for college, the pride in her eyes when she hugged me. Goodbye. My son's handshake firm and steady when he told me he wanted to be like me someday. Their futures, their trust in me, it wasn't something I could let Karen steal. I forced my hands to move, clawing at the rope. My fingers scraped raw against the fibers. The water pressed harder, colder, as if mocking my effort. I twisted, pulling, straining until my muscles screamed. Finally, I loosened one loop, then another. But Karen wasn't done. The rope jerked violently, dragging me deeper. Through the haze of bubbles, I glimpsed one of her cronies leaning over the dock, holding the other end of the rope like a fisherman reeling in his catch. Rage boiled inside me, hotter than the cold that threatened to consume me. If I was going down, I wasn't going quietly. I braced against the pull, curling my body tight before snapping my leg outward with everything I had. Pain exploded in my ankle, but the sudden motion loosened the rope just enough for me to slip free. My chest felt like it was on fire, my vision blurred, but I kicked toward the light above. When my head finally broke the surface, I gasped so violently it hurt. Air never tasted so sweet. But my relief was short-lived. Karen was still there, standing at the edge of the dock, lips curved in a smile colder than the water itself. "Persistent, aren't you?" she sneered. One of the men lunged, grabbing a long pole from a nearby boat. He jabbed it toward me like a spear, trying to push me back under. I ducked, letting the pole skim past my shoulder, then kicked toward the deeper part of the lake. The water was my enemy, yes, but it was also my shield. If I stayed close to the dock, they'd corner me. Out here, at least, I had space. They shouted, their voices sharp against the gentle lapping of waves. Karen barked orders, furious now that her clean little plan had gotten messy. I could almost hear the panic beneath her rage. "Finish it!" she screamed. But I didn't wait to see what they would try next. With every ounce of strength, I swam toward the far side of the lake, the trees looming like silent guardians. My arms felt heavy, my body sluggish, but adrenaline kept me moving. Each stroke was fueled by one thought: survive now, revenge later. By the time I pulled myself onto the muddy bank, my body trembled violently. My lungs wheezed, my ankle throbbed, and my clothes clung like chains. Across the water, I saw Karen pacing the dock, her silhouette frantic under the fading sun. She thought she'd won. She thought I was finished. And that's when it hit me. Let her think it. Let her celebrate. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge comes not from proving someone wrong immediately, but from letting them believe they were right just long enough for their arrogance to rot them from the inside. I crawled into the cover of the trees, dripping and broken, but very much alive. My heart steadied. My anger sharpened. Karen had made one fatal mistake. She hadn't checked to see if the corpse was real. That night, hidden in the shadows of Oak Ridge, I began to plan. Karen had tried to drown me for $1.2 billion. Now I would return to drown her in her own lies. By the time night swallowed Oak Ridge Estates, I had already slipped into the role of a ghost. To everyone else, I was gone drowned, another name whispered about at the clubhouse with solemn nods and fake sympathy. But in reality, I was very much alive, hiding in the cracks of Karen's kingdom, watching every move she made. The beauty of being dead is that nobody looks for you. Nobody suspects you're standing 3 rows behind them in the grocery store, or listening from the shadows when they gossip about the HOA president's unfortunate loss. And Karen. She was the loudest voice in the room, telling everyone how sorry she was, with a smile that betrayed her relief. Within 2 days, she was already parading around, draped in designer dresses that shimmered under the streetlights. The woman didn't even wait for a week of mourning before she started flaunting her supposed triumph. So tragic, she'd sigh to anyone who asked. But life moves on. Life moved on all right, straight into her greedy hands. From my vantage point tucked inside an old shed on my property, I began piecing the puzzle together. I hacked into the HOA's financial records, thanks to a little tech-savvy friend of mine who owed me a favor. What I found made my blood boil, and my lips curl into a smile at the same time. Karen wasn't just trying to grab my land. She had been siphoning money from the HOA's accounts for years, funneling it through shell companies, padding invoices, even creating fake vendors. And the numbers. They all pointed to one goal, the $1.2 billion development project. She had already pitched it to investors, promising she controlled every square inch of land, including mine. My death tied up the last loose end. At least that's what she thought. I couldn't just sit back and storm into the picture yet. No, not with Karen. She thrived on spectacle, on appearances. To take her down, I had to let her arrogance grow, let her dig her own grave while smiling for the cameras. So I followed her. One afternoon, she strutted into the Oak Ridge Country Club, her heels clicking against marble tiles like gunshots. From the corner hidden behind a ficus plant, I watched her sip martinis with the board members. She leaned in close voice, dripping with honey. With our dear neighbor gone, she purred, we can finally move forward without obstacles. They nodded, hypnotized by her confidence, blind to the poison laced in her words. I recorded every second on a discreet pen-shaped camera. The next day, she held a board meeting in her lavish living room, complete with catered hors d'oeuvres and champagne. I sat outside in the dark, peering through her massive glass windows. Inside, Karen waved a stack of papers like a trophy. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. Proof that the property is ours. Proof. My signature forged in sloppy ink. She laughed, and they laughed, with her oblivious that the very document she flaunted would soon serve as Exhibit A. But the most revealing moment came late that evening. After her guests left, Karen stood alone in front of her ornate mirror. She touched up her lipstick, stared at her reflection, and whispered, "Queen Karen." Finally. I swear, she curtsied to herself. The mask had slipped. Beneath the polished image she presented to the world was the real Karen, desperate, delusional, drunk on power. And I knew then this wasn't just about catching her red-handed. This was about showing everyone in Oak Ridge the monster that lived next door. I spent nights stitching the net tighter. Emails, bank transfers, doctored property claims. I collected them all, filing them neatly into a folder I labeled Crown of Lies. It grew thicker by the day. The more I gathered, the more dangerous my game became. Because if Karen even sniffed that I was alive, she wouldn't hesitate to finish what she started, so I stayed careful. Disguises became second nature, a baseball cap, a hoodie, sunglasses. I moved like a shadow, a ghost haunting her empire. And as I watched her preen in public, boasting about the upcoming celebration she was planning to mark the new era of Oak Ridge Estates, I couldn't help but grin. Because while she rehearsed her coronation, I was rehearsing her downfall. Every queen loves her mask. But what she never realizes is how fragile it is, how one crack, one tug can tear it off completely. And when that happened, I intended to be standing right in front of her, smiling while the whole neighborhood watched. Karen believed she had buried me beneath the lake. What she didn't know was that I had already begun digging her grave. The invitations went out 2 weeks after my death. Glossy embossed cards printed in gold lettering that read, "Oak Ridge Estates, HOA presents a night of triumph. Leave it to Karen to turn attempted murder into a gala event." She spun the narrative perfectly. According to her, the HOA had secured unprecedented funding, unified the community, and most importantly, eliminated all obstacles. I was the obstacle, apparently. She spoke of me like a line item in a budget removed, irrelevant, forgotten. What she didn't know was that I had secured my own invitation. I bribed one of the caterers who couldn't care less, whose name was on the guest list. A crisp envelope full of cash opened doors more easily than charm ever could. And just like that, I was scheduled to enter her coronation from the back hallway, disguised as part of the serving staff. The night of the event, Oak Ridge's clubhouse had been transformed into a palace. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light tables draped in silk champagne fountains bubbling like rivers of arrogance. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music a soundtrack to Karen's vanity. And then she arrived. Karen descended the staircase like royalty wrapped in a crimson gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. She wore diamonds that could blind the weak-willed and a smirk sharp enough to cut glass. The crowd erupted into applause, neighbors, investors, board members, all clapping like trained seals. "Welcome, everyone," Karen began, her voice carrying easily over the room. "Tonight, we celebrate the dawn of a new chapter. Oak Ridge Estates has never been stronger, wealthier, or more secure. And thanks to the sacrifices we've made." She paused dramatically, her eyes sweeping across the room as if I were just another ghost in the walls. "There is nothing standing in our way." They cheered. Glasses clinked. Money whispered between hands. I lingered near the back, dressed in black slacks and a crisp white shirt. A tray of champagne flutes balanced on my palm. No one looked twice at me. That was the beauty of power. People rarely noticed the hands serving them, only the ones holding the crown. From my vantage point, I studied Karen closely. She moved through the room like a predator, disguised as prey, soft smiles, gentle touches on shoulders, words laced with promises of wealth. Investors hung on her every word, blinded by the scent of money. But behind that mask, I saw the cracks widening. Her laugh came too quickly, her eyes darted too often toward the exits. She was nervous, though she'd never admit it. Then came the highlight of the night, Karen's grand announcement. She stood at the podium, a spotlight illuminating her perfectly powdered face. "Ladies and gentlemen," she purred, "it is my great honor to declare that Oak Ridge Estates is officially partnered with Silvercrest Developers. Together, we will reshape this community into a legacy worth over $1.2 billion. The room erupted in applause. Karen beamed, basking in the glow of false adoration. She raised a glass of champagne, her diamonds catching the light. "To Oak Ridge, to our future, and to our unshakable unity." "To Oak Ridge," they shouted back. "But unity built on lies never lasts." I shifted slightly, sliding the small USB drive deeper into my pocket. On it were the files I had painstakingly collected: emails, bank transfers, audio recordings of her boardroom manipulations. Everything I needed to shatter her empire in one stroke. The timing had to be perfect. Too soon, and I'd look like a madman barging into a party. Too late, and she'd solidify her position beyond reach. I needed her at her peak, drunk on applause, blind to danger. And tonight she was drunker than ever. As the night wore on, Karen worked the crowd with flawless precision. She posed for photos, whispered promises, and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. But I noticed something she probably didn't want anyone to see. Her hands shook slightly when she thought no one was watching. Her empire was built on quicksand, and deep down she knew it. From across the room, I locked eyes with her for a fleeting second. She didn't recognize me, not in the dim light, not dressed like a servant. But something in her expression shifted, a flicker of unease, a shadow of recognition that vanished as quickly as it appeared. She brushed it off, turning back to her guests. Good. Let her think it was her imagination. By the time dessert was served, a grotesque 3-tier cake shaped like a mansion, I was ready. The projector was set, the files uploaded to the system. One press of a button, and every guest in that room would see Karen's empire for what it really was: theft, lies, and attempted murder wrapped in silk. I glanced around at the faces in the crowd. Some were complicit, others ignorant, but all were guilty in their silence. They applauded Karen because it was easier than confronting her. But in a few moments, silence would no longer be an option. Karen raised her glass once more, her voice booming through the speakers, to the future of Oak Ridge, and I smiled, because her future was about to end tonight. I don't think anyone in that golden-lit room expected a ghost to crash the party. Least of all Karen. She was too busy basking in her own spotlight, sipping champagne like it was the nectar of the gods. Her empire was secure, or so she thought. I waited until the room reached peak noise, laughter clinking against crystal, the quartet swelling into a triumphant crescendo. Then I slipped from the shadows at the back, tray in hand, and walked straight toward the stage. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm, but carrying enough weight to slice through the noise. The music faltered. A few heads turned. Then a few more. And then silence. Karen froze at the podium, her smile plastered in place like it had been stapled there. She blinked once, twice. Her hand trembled around the glass. "No," she whispered. "You're dead," I offered, stepping into the light. I placed the tray down gently on the nearest table, straightened my jacket, and smiled. "Sorry to disappoint, Karen. Turns out I can swim." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman dropped her fork. One of the board members nearly choked on his wine. The investors exchanged confused glances, whispering furiously. Karen tried to recover her laugh, sharp and brittle. This is ridiculous. Some imposter? I tilted my head, still smiling. Funny. If I'm an imposter, then why do you look like you've seen a ghost? Her mask cracked. Just for a second, but enough. I stepped closer to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm the neighbor. Karen tried to erase the man who supposedly drowned in our very own Oak Ridge Lake. And tonight, since Karen loves parties so much, I thought I'd bring a little entertainment of my own. With that, I pulled the small remote from my pocket and pressed the button. The projector screen behind Karen flickered to life. At first, it was a spreadsheet: numbers, transactions amounts siphoned from HOA accounts into shell companies. Murmurs filled the room. Then came the emails, Karen's unmistakable tone dripping from every line. Make sure this is buried before the board sees it. Our neighbor won't be a problem much longer. The final clip was the pièce de résistance, the audio recording of Karen at the country club, her voice smooth and venomous. With our dear neighbor gone, we can finally move forward without obstacles. The room erupted in chaos. Investors shouted. Board members demanded explanations. One woman covered her mouth in horror. A man slammed his glass on the table, furious at being played. And Karen, she unraveled. Her face drained of color, then flushed crimson. This is doctored, she screamed, her voice shrill. None of this is real. He's lying. I leaned on the podium beside her, calm as ever. Karen, you've spent years building this mask of yours, perfect neighbor, loyal president, queen of Oak Ridge. But masks always crack. And tonight yours shattered. She spun toward the crowd, desperate. Don't listen to him. He's insane. He drowned himself in debt, not the lake. He's trying to ruin everything we've worked for. But the harder she shouted, the less they believed her. That's the thing about liars. Once the evidence piles high enough, even their loudest denials sound hollow. I turned back to the screen where her forged documents were displayed in all their ugly glory. Karen didn't just try to drown me. She tried to drown the truth. But the thing about truth, it floats. The audience erupted again, this time with gasps and accusations hurled her way. Karen's eyes darted around the room, wild and desperate. She spotted the exits, the doors, but they were already blocked, not by me, but by uniformed officers who had slipped in quietly during the chaos. The local PD, accompanied by 2 federal agents I'd contacted weeks earlier. Turns out fraud on the scale of $1.2 billion attracts more than neighborhood gossip. One of the agents stepped forward, badge gleaming. Karen Whitmore, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, and attempted murder. The gasp that followed was delicious. Karen shrieked, stumbling back from the podium. No, this is my night. You can't do this. I built this. I crossed my arms, smirking. Correction, you stole it. And now you're losing it. The officers closed in, snapping handcuffs around her wrists. She kicked, screamed, cursed my name. You'll regret this, she howled. Do you hear me? You'll regret ever crossing me. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough for her to hear. Funny. That's exactly what I thought when you tried to drown me. But here I am smiling, and here you are sinking. Her eyes burned with hatred, but there was nothing left she could do. She was finished. As they dragged her out, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Neighbors who once fawned over her turned away in disgust. Investors stormed off, vowing lawsuits. Board members whispered frantically about damage control. And me, I stood there calm in the storm, the ghost who came back to life. For the first time in years, the HOA's clubhouse didn't echo with Karen's voice. Instead, it echoed with truth. And that, my friends, was the sweetest music I'd ever heard. The sound of Karen's heels scraping against the floor as they dragged her out was a melody sweeter than the quartet's violins. For years, her voice had dominated every HOA meeting, every social gathering, every neighbor's dinner conversation. Now the only sound she made was a string of incoherent shrieks swallowed by the metallic click of handcuffs. The room buzzed with shock. Investors argued with one another, shoving papers into briefcases as if rescuing their sinking fortunes. Board members whispered, frantically desperate to distance themselves from Karen. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with me, as though my very presence reminded them of their complicity. I let them stew for a moment. There's a certain satisfaction in silence, the kind that makes people squirm more than yelling ever could. Then I cleared my throat, stepping back up to the podium where Karen had stood minutes earlier, basking in her delusion of royalty. Funny thing about queens, I began, voice steady. They love to believe their crowns are made of gold, but more often than not, those crowns are nothing but tin spray-painted to shine. Karen's crown just rusted in front of all of you. The murmurs grew louder. A few people nodded. One even clapped before realizing it wasn't the right moment. I held up the USB drive between my fingers. Everything you saw tonight, that's just the surface. What Karen's been doing goes far beyond embezzlement or fraud. She's manipulated each and every one of you neighbors, investors, even her so-called friends on the board. And the best part, she thought none of you would ever have the courage to stand against her. A man in a tailored suit, one of the big investors, stood up red-faced. Are you saying she's been lying to all of us this entire time? I raised an eyebrow. You needed me to tell you that. You signed deals with a woman who threw parties instead of audits, who wore diamonds while claiming the HOA was strapped for funds, who smiled while digging graves for anyone who got in her way. Did you really think that kind of power was built on honesty? The man sat down silenced. I scanned the room, locking eyes with familiar faces. Mrs. Thompson, who once scolded me for letting my grass grow half an inch too long. Mr. Daniels, who voted in favor of Karen's absurd fines because she seemed confident. All of them had played along, too afraid or too lazy to question her. You all let her reign, I said, voice firm. You gave her power. You laughed at her jokes, signed her papers, and looked the other way when she trampled over your neighbors. She didn't build her empire alone, you handed her the bricks. That landed. Faces fell. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked genuinely ashamed. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so the silence pressed heavier. But here's the thing. You don't get to blame her entirely. You don't get to act shocked now. Because if you stay silent when someone like Karen rises, you're just as guilty when she tries to drown someone like me. The words hung in the air like smoke, and then applause. Not loud at first, but slow, deliberate. It came from the back one of the younger residents, a man I barely knew. Then another joined in, and another, until half the room was clapping, not for Karen, not for me exactly, but for the truth that had finally surfaced. I didn't bask in it. I wasn't here for their approval. My victory had already been sealed when Karen was hauled out in handcuffs. Still, it was a moment of poetic justice watching the same crowd that once worshipped her now applauding her downfall. As the noise died down, the federal agent stepped forward again. We'll be taking custody of all these documents, he said, gesturing to the projector and the files. But rest assured, this isn't over. Karen will be facing serious charges. I nodded. Good. Because she tried to drown more than just me, she tried to drown the truth. And I don't plan on letting her come up for air again. The agent gave me a respectful nod before turning to manage the chaos of panicked investors and rattled neighbors. I stayed behind a moment longer, surveying the wreckage of Karen's empire. The cake, shaped like a mansion, now sagged under the heat of the lights, frosting sliding down like melting walls. Glasses lay overturned champagne, dripping like wasted promises. Her throne room had become her crime scene. And me, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not just because I'd survived her attempt on my life, but because I'd proven something far more important. Bullies only thrive when we let them. As I walked toward the exit, one of the board members stopped me. What happens now? Without Karen, who leads the HOA, I smirked, pausing just long enough to let the silence work. Anyone but her. And with that, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The stars stretched across the sky, bright and endless, reflected in the same lake where Karen thought she'd buried me. For the first time, I looked at that water and felt no fear, only gratitude. Because it wasn't my grave. It was my rebirth. Karen's empire had crumbled. Her allies had abandoned her. And her $1.2 billion prize, it was already slipping from her fingers straight into the hands of those who actually owned it. Revenge, as they say, is a dish best served cold. But tonight it tasted like champagne left behind at a party that wasn't hers anymore. The night Karen was dragged out in cuffs, I thought the story was over. After all, what more could there be? She was exposed, humiliated, her empire shattered in front of the very people who once kissed her ring. But villains rarely fall quietly, and Karen wasn't one to go down without dragging others into the abyss. The following morning, the news hit every channel. HOA president arrested for $1.2 billion fraud scheme. Her face was plastered across screens, her mugshot a far cry from the queenly image she curated. Reporters swarmed Oak Ridge estates like vultures, shoving microphones in neighbors' faces. And of course, everyone who had once worshipped her now claimed they always suspected something. Hypocrisy is contagious, especially when the cameras are rolling. But the real twist came when I got a call from one of the federal agents. We dug deeper, he said. Karen wasn't working alone. Apparently, Karen had cut deals with people far beyond Oak Ridge, corrupt contractors, shady bankers, even a politician or two. And when she was arrested, those so-called allies didn't rally to her defense. No, they turned on her, instantly feeding the feds every detail in exchange for leniency. The woman who prided herself on loyalty and control was betrayed by the very snakes she invited into her garden. That was Karen's fatal blind spot. She thought greed created loyalty. In reality, greed only creates sharper knives. 2 weeks later, the HOA gathered for an emergency meeting to elect a new president. I didn't attend. I had no interest in wearing the crown Karen once flaunted. Power wasn't what I wanted, it never was. What I wanted was peace, and maybe a lawn no one wrote passive-aggressive letters about. But I did walk by the clubhouse as the meeting ended. Through the glass doors, I caught glimpses of neighbors debating fiercely, arguing about responsibility and oversight. For the first time in years, they weren't blindly following one voice. They were questioning, demanding answers, holding each other accountable. Maybe that was the silver lining of Karen's downfall. The neighborhood finally learned that silence breeds monsters. Later that night, I stood by the lake, the same lake where she tried to drown me. The water was calm moonlight scattering across its surface. I half expected to see her reflection rise from the depths, hissing curses at me. But all I saw was my own face, tired but alive, smiling faintly at the irony. Behind me, footsteps crunched on gravel. I turned to find one of Karen's former cronies, the man who had once held the rope around my leg. He looked older, smaller somehow. "I didn't know it would go that far," he muttered, unable to meet my eyes. "I thought it was just intimidation. I didn't know she meant to." "To kill me, I finished for him." He winced, nodding. "I'm sorry." I let the silence stretch heavy as the water around us. Then I said, "You tied the knot, you held the rope. Don't tell me you didn't know where it led." He didn't reply. He just walked away, shoulders hunched, swallowed by the night. That was the last loose end. Karen was gone, her allies scattered, her empire dissolved. Oak Ridge Estates would rebuild itself, not through her vision, but through the lessons she left behind. And me, I walked home lighter than I'd felt in years. Because in the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about proving that no matter how deep someone tries to bury you, the truth has a way of clawing back to the surface. Karen drowned in her own lies, and I learned how to breathe underwater. Stories like this might sound larger than life, but the lesson beneath them is painfully real. Unchecked greed and blind power always collapse sooner or later. Karen thought her empire was unshakable because she built it on fear. She silenced neighbors, manipulated friends, and believed loyalty could be bought with promises of wealth. But in the end, fear turns to anger, and greed always eats itself alive. For me, surviving wasn't just about escaping the lake, it was about patience. Instead of rushing headfirst into confrontation, I stepped back, gathered evidence, and let her arrogance expose her. Sometimes the strongest weapon you have isn't anger or fists, it's time. Waiting, watching, and striking when your enemy is too drunk on their own victory to notice the dagger slipping between the cracks. In real life, we all meet people like Karen. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe not with billions at stake, but people who thrive on control, manipulation, and selfishness. The lesson is simple: don't stay silent. Don't let them drown you in lies. Because once you stand up, once you bring truth to the surface, the power they cling to vanishes. So tell me, what's the biggest Karen moment you've ever witnessed in your own life? Drop your story in the comments, I'd love to hear it. And if you want more drama, revenge, and HOA madness, make sure to subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.